Muy buenas tardes. Y bueno, empezamos ya. Me comentaba Nacho que le había dicho José María Arelza que viniera con tiempo y bueno, esto no es la puntualidad británica y por eso hemos empezado un poco más tarde porque Nacho se nos ha retrasado un poco. Pero bueno, yo quería darles la bienvenida. Soy Gadea de la Viuda y para mí, bueno, pues es siempre un honor y una suerte dar las palabras de bienvenida en este auditorio de Abante. Hoy lo hago como presidenta de la Fundación Abante, pero sobre todo como patrona de la Fundación Análisis de Política Exterior, que hoy presentamos con este excelente número, que hay que felicitar al equipo de Política Exterior, el número 216, que está inspirado en el libro de Gideon Rachman, La era de los líderes autoritarios. Tenemos la suerte además de que hoy nos acompaña Gideon aquí en el auditorio y con Ignacio Torreblanca. Buenas tardes, bienvenidos. Thank you very much and welcome to Madrid. Y también daros las gracias a todos vosotros. Sé que hoy es un día complicado, competimos con otros muchos eventos en Madrid que nos han dicho. Y bueno, pues la verdad es que para mí es muy emocionante siempre ver el auditorio con este lleno completo. Veo muchas personas ilustres, muchos amigos, muchas caras conocidas. Y bueno, pues agradeceroslo de verdad que nos acompañéis este rato. Para los que quizás conocéis menos Abante, pues quizás os preguntéis qué hace una institución financiera pues a través de una fundación apoyando al proyecto de política exterior. Pero si os digo la verdad es que lo teníamos casi escrito en nuestro destino, porque nuestra relación con política exterior pues ha sido larga. Hemos tenido pues un contacto estrecho en las distintas etapas. Tenemos hoy con nosotros a Darío Barcárcel y a Rafael Atienza que nos acompañan. También en la época que se hizo cargo de la misma Josep Piqué, pues Santiago Satrústegui y yo, el presidente, tuvimos la suerte de estar reunidos con Josep Piqué justamente para buscar vías de colaboración entre política exterior y Abante. Y bueno, pues todos los que estamos aquí que le conocimos, pues guardamos un recuerdo inmejorable de él y bueno, pues tenemos a Gloria hoy que nos acompaña también. Bienvenida y gracias por venir. Y hace unos meses uno de nuestros socios, José Ramón Iturriaga, que también está por aquí sentado, nos planteaba a Santiago y a mí pues, la posibilidad de participar en esta nueva etapa de política exterior. Y bueno, pues la verdad es que con estos antecedentes pues os podéis imaginar que no podíamos decir que no. Y hoy estamos aquí. Vamos a participar desde la Fundación Abante como patronos de la Fundación Análisis de Política Exterior. Y ello también porque bueno, pues el propósito que nosotros tenemos desde la Fundación de Abante pues, a la vez encaja muy bien con la labor que hace Política Exterior. Nosotros desde la Fundación queremos fomentar el conocimiento y el pensamiento crítico, que creemos que es muy importante en esta sociedad en la que vivimos. Y por otro lado, pues también queremos apoyar a otras instituciones y fundaciones que entienden de la misma manera que nosotros cómo hay que participar en la sociedad civil. Y bueno, pues creemos que la Fundación Política Exterior cumple estas dos aspiraciones que nosotros tenemos también como fundación, bueno, pues por su vocación que tiene hacia el interés general y también bueno, pues por el interés que presta a España y a América Latina en su aportación desde la revista. Ese fue un poco los orígenes de la creación de la revista y como siempre me recuerda Gaspar cuando estoy con él, pues me dice que queremos fomentar un debate rico en matices, atrevido, decididamente abierto, tan necesario en un momento como el actual. Pues nosotros desde la Fundación de Abante queremos apoyar esta iniciativa. Y finalmente, hoy es un día para celebrar que la publicación sigue viva gracias al inmenso trabajo que han hecho este nuevo equipo, siempre recogiendo, por supuesto, el legado de los que les han precedido en esta aventura. Yo creo que hay que darles la enhorabuena. Es muy valiente el hacerse cargo de una publicación como Política Exterior y de tratar que siga viva y presente entre nosotros. Este número que hoy nos traen es excepcional, yo recomiendo su lectura. También, como siempre decimos en Abante, hay que suscribirse a la revista, es importante, hay que apoyarles en todos los frentes. Y bueno, pues esto merece un vino navideño que nos tomaremos cuando termine el evento en la terraza de la 8ª planta, en la que bueno, pues podremos compartir un rato y donde les aseguro que además son inmejorables las vistas sobre Madrid. Pues nada, muchas gracias y que disfruten de la conversación.
Hola, buenas tardes. Yo soy Gaspar Atienza, presidente de la Fundación Análisis de Política Exterior. Muchas gracias, Gadea, y gracias a todos por acudir a este acto con doble propósito, ¿no? Presentamos el número 216 de la revista que fundó Darío hace 36 años y que Josep llevó durante 4 años hasta primavera de este año. Y presentamos también la Fundación. Es la primera vez que presentamos la Fundación Análisis de Política Exterior en público. Thank you, Gideon, Nacho, for being here with us today. Thanks for bringing today a debate about values and leadership in foreign affairs and geopolitics and the highest level that you can bring, that we can have in Europe today. I'm just going to give a few words about the Foundation in Spanish, and then José, the new director, is going to go on to introduce Gideon and Nacho and head to the discussion. Política Exterior es un debate, busca un debate permanente sobre las relaciones de España con el mundo exterior. Estas palabras son de Darío Valcárcel, de hace 36 años. Darío exigía entonces, en el año 87, 2 condiciones para este debate. Que se mantuviera abierto a todos los que dentro y fuera de España pudieran resultar afectados por la política exterior, por el curso de nuestra política exterior, y que se construyera ajeno a intereses de partido, a elogios y a descalificaciones personales. Josep Piqué tomó el relevo de Darío en 2020, poco antes de la pandemia, cuando la pandemia estaba oscureciendo un mundo de por sí lleno de incertidumbre. El empeño de Josep fue, en sus mismas palabras, ofrecer luz, capacidad de interpretación y comprensión allí donde prevalece la confusión y la incertidumbre. Sus cartas del editor y sus múltiples contribuciones e intervenciones en este campo nos siguen guiando incluso después de su fallecimiento en primavera de este año. Ahora es la Fundación, creada por el mismo Josep, la que recoge el testigo intelectual de estos 2 gigantes de la política exterior española, con vocación al bien común, con especial atención a los intereses de España y de América Latina. Esta entidad sin ánimo de lucro, aspira a conseguir un análisis riguroso, independiente, excelente de la política exterior española. El objeto de la Fundación no es otro que fomentar y procurar un debate que nos permita a todos los líderes políticos, empresariales, sociales, jurídicos, académicos, analizar mejor las relaciones de España con el mundo exterior. Queremos entender cómo una geopolítica en acelerada transformación nos afecta como país, como ciudadanos, en nuestros intereses, en nuestras ideas y en nuestro presente y nuestro futuro. Queremos plantear un debate respetuoso, pero que no rehúya las complejidades, las diferentes perspectivas de cada asunto internacional. Queremos también que nuestra labor contribuya a defender el Estado de Derecho, la sociedad abierta, la democracia liberal, el pluralismo, que nos vertebran, son principios que nos vertebran y nos permiten aspirar a ser uno de los mejores países del mundo. A través de nuestras publicaciones y de nuestras actividades, buscamos ser un foro y un espacio de diálogo sereno, reflexivo y honesto, muy honesto. Un espacio que aporte esa luz a la que se refería Josep y que influya en la construcción de la política exterior de un país de enorme riqueza colectiva. No buscamos imponer ideas, queremos debatirlas, queremos confrontarlas. Pensamos que una sociedad buena, una sociedad rica, es aquella en la que existen multitud de instituciones independientes y libres que permiten y fomentan el pluralismo político y de pensamiento. Buscamos preguntas incómodas y debates en los que la verdad se compone de muchas voces. Queremos analizar y apoyar los intereses de España. Queremos resaltar la importancia de las empresas y la economía española y su relevancia en la definición del rol global de nuestro país. Queremos también impulsar un debate esencial sobre nuestra política exterior al que contribuya tanto el sector público como el privado. Henry Kissinger alertaba del peligro que podía suponer que la política exterior de un país se convirtiera en una subcategoría, una división de la política nacional de ese país, que eso le apartaba de una visión estratégica y no le permitiría al país analizar el futuro en realidad. Pensamos desde la Fundación que vivimos en una época de posibilidades infinitas, pero solo si analizamos la realidad internacional desde una perspectiva histórica, moral, legal y también pragmática, seremos capaces de entender la veloz transformación del orden mundial y el papel de España en el mundo que le rodea. Permitidme unas notas de agradecimiento a todos vosotros por estar aquí en este acto de presentación del número 216 y de la Fundación, porque hoy también para la Fundación cierra una época de transición, hoy es nuestro cierre. Y primero quiero dar las gracias a Abante, a Santiago Satrústegui, a Gadea de la Vida, a Joaquín Casasus y muy especialmente, y por una generosidad infinita, por su generosidad infinita, a José Returriaga. Abante y todo su equipo han apoyado a la Fundación, entienden y nos apoyan y nos impulsan en la labor que pretendemos acometer. Abante además nos acoge hoy en la sede de la Plaza de la Independencia. Y no es poca cosa. Y nosotros ponemos aquí, en la Plaza de la Independencia, nuestro principal valor, que es la independencia. Quiero también agradecer al excelente equipo de Política Exterior, a Pedro Rodríguez, nuestro nuevo director de contenidos, a Pilar Ortega, directora financiera, a Gabriela González Castejón, directora de Relaciones Institucionales, y a Jaime Colbrook, de Comunicación y Edición Digital, y a un amplísimo equipo de colaboradores externos que no puedo nombrar aquí hoy, por su esfuerzo, su fe y su determinación por sacar adelante este proyecto. La Fundación tiene la suerte de contar con un patronato comprometidísimo y del máximo prestigio. Su labor y compromiso es fundamental y también se lo quiero agradecer. No tengo palabras, no tengo capacidad, no tengo palabras suficientes para agradecer el apoyo de Belén Becerril, vicepresidenta de la Fundación, y de José María de Areiza, el nuevo director de la revista Política Exterior. La nueva etapa que estamos presentando aquí hoy es inconcebible sin ellos. Voy terminando. Primero con un agradecimiento y reconocimiento muy ferviente a Darío Valcárcel. Darío es el fundador, creador, editor y consejero delegado de esta revista durante más de 30 años. Darío, hoy la Fundación recoge tu legado y aspira a enriquecer el debate sobre las relaciones de España con el mundo exterior, como tú decías, que tú iniciaste en 1987. Y también quiero recordar, reconocer y agradecer el liderazgo intelectual y la enorme labor de Josep Piqué todo el tiempo que estuvo a cargo de Política Exterior durante los dificilísimos años de la pandemia. Y agradecer muy sinceramente a Gloria Lomana que esté hoy en este acto con nosotros. Muchas gracias, Gloria. También quiero expresar mi agradecimiento a todos aquellos que durante tanto tiempo, durante tantos años, han apoyado a Política Exterior. Y muy especialmente a Pepe Gómez Navarro, a Javier Enjumea, a Joaquín Tamames, Manuel Alabart, Carlos López Blanco, Aurea Moltó y a Betina Rodríguez Samones. También quiero dar las gracias a Rafael Atienza, mi padre. Padre también es antiguo presidente de la Sociedad Política Exterior. Le quiero agradecer su generosidad, su visión y su paciencia en el proceso de transición hacia la Fundación. Y ya para finalizar, esta vez de verdad, quiero dar las gracias a Lucía Corsini, mi mujer, que no me ha dejado que me rinda y me ha dado luz y fortaleza cuando más me faltaba. Gracias, Lucía. Tiene la palabra nuestro nuevo director, José María de Areiza. Muchas gracias.
Buenas tardes, se oye bien, ¿verdad? No soy el tercer presentador, con lo cual voy a intentar ser breve porque lo importante está aún por llegar. Es un placer estar hoy con todos vosotros. Creo que el reconocimiento más importante que tenemos que hacer esta noche es a Gaspar Atienza. Hace 6 meses, después de la pérdida irreparable de Josep Piqué, Gaspar se ofreció a presidir la Fundación y a hacer mucho más, a sacarla adelante, en un momento muy difícil. Gracias, Gaspar, por tu visión, por tu trabajo, por tu entrega, por tu ejemplo, que yo entiendo como tu compromiso con el servicio del bien común. Y mis palabras no son un gesto de amistad, una vieja amistad que nos une, sino son palabras de justicia, para decir que hoy no estaríamos aquí sin una extraordinaria labor que ha desempeñado Gaspar en menos de un año. Y creo que este agradecimiento es también de parte del equipo profesional, del que tengo la suerte de formar parte, Pedro, Gabriela, Pilar, Jaime, que trabajamos en la revista, en la web, en las demás publicaciones de la Fundación, y queremos transmitir nuestro más profundo agradecimiento. Y también creo que hay un agradecimiento por parte de los lectores, de las empresas que nos apoyan, del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores, que siempre ha estado ahí con la revista, y de todos los que entienden la necesidad de que en España y en el mundo que piensa en español haya una revista como Política Exterior. En este número 216 que hoy presentamos, la carta a los lectores se titula Cambiar para crecer. Nos mantenemos fieles al gran legado de Darío Valcárcel, de Rafael Atienza, de Josep Piqué, y es un placer hoy saludar a Gloria Lomana, es un honor tenerte aquí, Gloria, y de tantos autores y colaboradores a lo largo de 36 años. Como ha dicho nuestro presidente, la nueva etapa empieza en el mejor momento, en el más interesante, cuando las relaciones internacionales pasan por una mutación. Ya no hay un marco rígido que podemos dar por supuesto. Vivimos en un mundo furioso, en expresión de Giulio Tremonti, con nuevas divisiones y amenazas. La prosperidad global ha sido sustituida por la seguridad nacional o regional como el principal vector para entender la geopolítica. Y los europeos estamos mal preparados para este nuevo escenario global, como explica muy bien Josep Borrell al decir que somos herbívoros en un mundo de carnívoros. Desde Política Exterior queremos contribuir al debate de ideas sobre las relaciones internacionales. Otro buen amigo, Javier Gómez, siempre dice que las ideas son mucho más importantes que la economía, el derecho, la empresa o las relaciones internacionales, porque el trabajo de las ideas genera las demandas que luego satisfacen todos estos ámbitos de la vida económica y social. Pues bien, Política Exterior no es solo un grupo de publicaciones, es una red de expertos, es también una actividad de debate, es una comunidad. Y no queremos conformar un think tank, sino un think. Queremos ser un sitio donde compartamos nuestra experiencia de análisis riguroso, plural, abierto, cercano a muy diferentes sensibilidades políticas y sociales. Debates, publicaciones siempre cercanos a los intereses de España y de la Unión Europea y a los valores que vertebran nuestra vida ciudadana, ese vivir juntos y libres que empezamos a aprender en la transición. El número 216, como veréis, tiene una portada muy cuidada del gran ilustrador Juárez Casanova y además de los artículos que pueden encontrar en las secciones de actualidad y de estudios, hay una sección final que hemos trabajado mucho, muy potente. Se titula, también en homenaje a Josep Piqué, Leer más. Ahí podéis encontrar 6 reseñas, 6 claves sobre un asunto internacional hechas por el gran Pedro Rodríguez, 6 reseñas, un mapa comentado y también una caricatura. Allow me to switch into English to introduce the main theme of this new issue of the magazine, since the debate between Gideon and Nacho will take place in this language. We approach in the studies section of the magazine, of this issue of the magazine, a classic theme, the intersection between leadership and international relations. In our times of accelerated change, institutions are weakened, and it's personalities who count. When institutions and international regimes fail to deliver, a lot of people turn to leaders, sometimes saviors, and they're full of magical thinking. They look for simple solutions to complex problems, and then they blame external enemies. We've seen it. The best book to understand this pandemic of strongman leadership was written not long ago by our friend Gideon Rachman, The Age of the Strong Man, How the Cult of the Leader Threatens Democracy Around the World. His book is destined to become a classic and will withstand the passage of time. It has inspired our magazine issue. Our studies section opens with Gideon's own reflections, and it is followed by articles about the possible comeback of Donald Trump, the power style of Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping impatient leadership, and also on the proliferation of strong men in Latin America and Africa. So there's nothing better to really launch this new chapter and the new issue of Política Exterior than a dialogue in the next 40-45 minutes between Gideon and José Ignacio. Gideon Rachman became Chief Foreign Affairs columnist for the Financial Times in 2006. After a 15-year career at The Economist, he has been a foreign correspondent in Brussels, Washington, Bangkok. He's also edited The Economist Business and Asia sections. His many interests include American foreign policy, the European Union, and globalization. Last year, he was so kind that he came to my course in London. Since then, nobody thinks that I can bring good guest speakers because they compared them with you, so you were terrible. Nacho Torreblanca is also a dear friend of Política Exterior. He's a professor of political science, a columnist at El Mundo, director of the Madrid office of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and member of the editorial board of Política Exterior. Those of us who do research and write on European integration issues turn to him all the time for new ideas and the best analysis available. Thank you, Nacho. Thank you, Gideon.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm very embarrassed to be late, but when I put this in my calendar a couple of months ago, I put 7:30, so I was entirely happy on my way here. So apologies for that, especially with the auditorium today and with the towering figures that I have here today, who are references to me and who have always been references. I started my studies in political science in 1987. Studying in political science and international relations, and we devoured Política Exterior. And I've been doing that ever since, because it was the material where we would find things that would challenge us, and articles that we usually won't find in the tone and in the topic in our library as researchers in our dissertations and so on. So this has been a companion, as Darío and all the directors and all the people that have been in Política Exterior for so many years. So I'm so honored and so pleased to be here. And of course also, I enjoyed a lot the continued conversations that we had with Josep when he took the helm, and also the spirit of the magazine, of the journal. And I think we are very orphan in this country of public spaces in which we can debate in freedom across party lines and with a global view. And Política Exterior is a great public good for that. And all of you, and many of you are around, I've known you for years. You have allowed me to challenge your view, and you've challenged my views. I see Emilio Lamo around. I have always the pleasure of disagreeing with him in so many things, right, and learning from him so many times. But he always, taught me to come back with new arguments and more arguments. And this is what I think this journal is about. So I'm also a column writer, so I already started reading you a long time ago. And I said, when I grow up, I want to be like Gideon. But I'm growing up and I don't quite get there, so there must be something you have to tell us about the art of writing columns for FT, which we all enjoy so much. Gideon, it's a pleasure to have you here. And the topic that you brought to the table and to this event couldn't be, of course, more timely. And I will start also with a confession that as a student of political science, I don't remember, this was 5 years at the time, with full semesters. I don't remember having received a course on leadership. This was not a subject matter. Political leadership at a faculty of political science until very recently. We discussed institutions. Institutions matter, institutions do matter indeed. And people, leaders, and personality were something out there that we wanted maybe to get rid, very uncomfortable because there were single case studies and so on. So my first question is, in writing this and when you come to this topic, when do you think, or when do you realize that all we know about democracy and institutions and all these kind of things is not as relevant, or you found something which is equally as relevant, which is this strong man? When does the era of strong men start, at least intellectually, as a challenge to you? And how do you cope with the challenge of not finding a single, probably, book on political leadership in the discipline, or a kind of major study? Or was it that you find revealing for you and broke the path? Or did you just venture on your own to do this?
Well, thanks, Nacho, and thanks, Jose, and thanks everyone for inviting me here. And it's an honor to be here when you're relaunching the magazine. Well, it's interesting you should say that. Nobody's asked me that, but I think there's a kind of obvious answer, which is I never studied political science. I studied history, and history is full of strongman leaders. So it didn't seem to me surprising that they should be a factor, or that personalities could change the course of events. It's always been a battle between... Well, I think if you come at it from a sort of historical perspective, you're more prepared to accept that individuals can matter, because you're more prepared to accept that accident can matter, that things don't... the whole concept behind political science, I think, is that you can somehow identify almost a model that will tell you how things will proceed. And I think as a historian, you know, I wasn't a professional historian, but somebody who studied history, that never seemed to me a totally convincing explanation, because accidents can happen, you know, things can go one way or another, and individuals matter, and the whole, particularly if you looked at, you know, certainly if you studied modern European history, it was hard to deny the, you know, importance of charismatic leaders. And so I suppose when I started thinking about writing about contemporary politics, you know, you always have to hesitate about saying it's exactly like the 1930s. It's never exactly like the 1930s, but there are echoes of it. And, you know, one of the books that got me thinking was reading a book. It was a memoir of a guy called Sebastian Haffner called Defying Hitler. It's actually not a great title because it's really just a memoir of growing up in Weimar Germany in the 1920s and 30s. And one of the strengths of the book is that he recalls the arguments he was having with his father at the time, where he said, you know, I was this young guy saying, you know, what's happening in Germany is incredibly serious and dangerous and worrying, and his father was saying, look, calm down, it's not that bad, we'll get through it, etc., etc. And then years later he says, you know, I think in retrospect I was right and my father was wrong. But it seemed to me that in the early Trump years, a lot of people in America were having similar arguments, you know, is this really a threat to democracy, or are we just getting a bit hysterical and it's, you know, it's not politics as we know it? And then another thing I noticed is that I have a sort of strange, nice job, but it involves going around the world a lot, and that a lot of different countries were having similar sounding debates, you know, so that I would, you know, be in Delhi and Indian intellectuals were saying, you know, we don't like what Modi is doing, but is this really a threat to Indian democracy, or is it just a form of populism that we don't like? And even in a country like China, which was never a democracy, there was still a battle going on between liberals and authoritarian nationalists. So that in 2012, when I was in China, you know, you could go to a restaurant with a bunch of university professors and they would be willing to argue in public about whether China should become a democracy. That wouldn't be possible now. And one of the reasons it's not possible is that they have an authoritarian nationalist leader who has also rolled back things, but done it in a way that's kind of familiar to us in the West, through the establishment of a cult of personality, through the destruction of institutions. So it seemed to me that, you know, and I go through all the various case studies in the book, that something global was happening around authoritarian leadership.
Because in fact, it is not only democracies but also authoritarian regimes that become more authoritarian and more nationalist, which is funny because that doesn't allow us to do a clear divide with what. But before that, and at the risk of boring our audience with academic quarrels, I was also eager to ask you how or why you didn't venture that much, or whether you did it and you didn't find interest into psychology, into individual psychology, and because when you go back to the 20s and 30s, political science was very much emerging from behavioralism and conductism, and they would look at the personality of leaders. And there's some classics like psychopathology and international politics, personal insecurity. So there was a whole trend of things looking at dictators from kind of are they tall or not? Yeah. Are they complex or not? But now we have a good spectrum of authoritarian leaders to go back to, you know, psychology. Do you find anything interesting in this literature about personality and authoritarian personality, or do you think this is just very crappy and doesn't?
No, I mean, you know, actually, my father was a psychologist, but maybe that put me off.
Yeah, that's why you became a historian.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I mean, I was less interested in the personalities of the leaders themselves, because then in why people followed them, than in the kind of the pictures that they were making. Because I think you have, I mean, now you mention it, I think that there are similarities. They're often very highly narcissistic people. You know, they tend to be people who want the system to be about themselves. But then I think what's interesting, I think those kinds of personalities are around all the time. The question is, why do people turn to them at a particular time in history? So I guess that was what interested me, and the commonalities between the pictures that they made. And I think that broadly speaking, almost all the leaders in the book, and I start with Putin and then I go through Erdogan in Turkey, Xi Jinping in China, Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in America, Duterte in the Philippines.
There is only one woman in this book, and it's Merkel, which not kind of an authoritarian.
She was put in as the antithesis. Actually,
exactly, but there is only one woman mentioned in this.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's not an accident. I think that the style of leadership is very macho. It's about projecting strength and a particularly kind of male idea of strength. And maybe if you want to look at sort of social explanations, one of the reasons there was at least an appetite for some of these leaders is that part of what's going on is a backlash against social change. There tend to be backward-looking leaders who say things were better in the past. And well, what has been the big social changes? Feminism and the rise of women leaders and women in society. And if you look at what these leaders pitch, it tends to be, amongst other things, a very traditionalist view of society, particularly anti-gay stuff, but I think generally, around the idea of the strong man as a leader.
Yeah, and then you mentioned there are 4 main characteristics which you find in common with all these leaders, and maybe for the audience, what are these basic elements that you see, despite the difference in context and so on, that you see across the board?
I would actually now, having talked about it loads of times, now shrink it down to 2, actually, which is probably easier to remember anyway. I mean, I think that that firstly, they tend to evoke a sense of crisis. So they're all leaders who say, the country's in a mess in one way or another, or society's in a mess. And that is why you need a strongman leader.
A danger. Yeah.
So they will say, and what that crisis is can differ from country to country. So that, for, say, Duterte in the Philippines or Bolsonaro in Brazil, they talked about high crime, and Duterte said, I'm going to go around, and indeed there was strong public support for just shooting supposed drug dealers in the streets. Suspend the rule of law. We can't afford that anymore. We've got to go and just deal with this with strength. And then, but for Putin, it was more that the West has moved right up to Russia's borders, that the nation is at threat. Xi Jinping recently has been talking about efforts to contain and suppress China and the need to strengthen leadership around him. And then Trump in the United States says, the whole world is laughing at us, there's American carnage, the country's collapsing, we can't go on like this, therefore you need a strong leader. And then I think the second characteristic, as well as evoking a sense of crisis, is saying because of that, we can't afford all these kind of liberal ideas about checks and balances and, allowing that the liberal elites have kind of captured society and their power needs to be broken. And so it creates a sense of emergency and then a call for a strong man leader who will break the rules to put things to rights.
And one question maybe you faced before is, and I'll explain it later, is the question of, are these guys stupid? In the sense that they're not generally very well trained. You mentioned in the book that Xi Jinping missed his formation years in the middle of nowhere, just punished or doing kind of whatever, cultural revolution thing, but he's not a passionate reader. You say that at some point now in the past, maybe he has tried to compensate for that, but he doesn't come out as a very educated or intelligent person. Of course, Trump probably never read a book. So the pattern of, I mean, a very obvious question is, how can these guys, being so poorly trained, can actually be so successful politically? So obviously they're not stupid, but they're not very well trained.
No, well, define stupidity. I mean, they may not be very well educated classically. And Trump, I think, Rex Tillerson, who appointed him as, who Trump appointed as his Secretary of State, said Trump was a moron. But clearly he had something. He understood, so he had a very instinctive understanding of American politics, of what American people wanted to hear. And maybe because he wasn't educated in the way that you, me, or most of the audience are educated, he was unconventional. So he was prepared to break with what people thought an establishment politician should do, and he relied much more on intuition. So that if you think about the 2016 election campaign, I think we're now used to Trump breaking taboos. But back then, he said several times things where people like me or my American equivalents would say, oh, well, he's finished. You can't say that. You know, that's it. But in fact, he understood in a way that they didn't, the way you could move politics. So, yeah, he wouldn't write a very good essay about it, but he understood something. And I think Putin is actually sharper than Trump. I mean, quicker. I think he's also fallen prey to delusions over time, but he was, in a way, had a more conventional upbringing through the state and so on. But again, although I don't think he's a stupid man, I think he's essentially an instinctive politician. These people have a sense of power, really, where power lies and how to exercise it.
So we've seen a debate in the last days, weeks, in the US whether Trump 2.0 would actually be a real dictator. That he has now ideas that were maybe instinctive in the first place because he didn't expect to win, but now his experience in government has actually shaped how should he behave in order to stay in power after a second mandate by punishing friends. So, and it's quite amazing that, I mean, this is not a marginal debate. This is New York Times, this is Washington. Everyone is discussing that. So my question is, supposedly, the US constitutional system is built, designed to sustain an attack by someone, by Trump. I mean, it was, the founding fathers were precisely thinking of this, right? Or of something like this. Charismatic dictator. Yet, he has good chances of getting away with a lot of things, not only winning in second term, but also, you know, subverting the system to a extent to which we saw last time that, you know, had Mike Pence not signed the results, which he could have done, then you would have emergency law and maybe seizure of ballot boxes, and then the election would have been destroyed de facto. And so do you fear really that Trump 2.0 would actually be able not to just damage, but to do substantial harm and to destroy US democracy? Is this something we should worry? What is the probability?
We should certainly worry about it. Whether he'll be able to do it, I'm afraid we'll only find out if and when he tries it. But you're right. It is a very weird moment when people are openly debating whether American democracy is about to collapse. I was in Washington 2 weeks ago, and one of the articles I think you might be referring to was Robert Kagan's article about, you know, we're on the point of dictatorship in America. And I was at a meeting of senior European diplomats and their American equivalents and one or two think tankers and people like me. And Kagan was the after-dinner speaker, and he was giving this speech, and I just suddenly thought, this is kind of surreal that you have the heads of the sort of German and British foreign ministries, and everyone's quietly taking notes as this guy's explaining that American democracy might be over within a year, and nobody says, you know, this guy's crazy, take him out. They think, oh yeah, that sounds possible. And certainly people are... Trump is making much more obvious preparations now to thwart what he regards as the deep state. And I think you have to at least attempt to put yourself in the shoes of Trump supporters, because they will say that he himself has been the victim of lawfare, that he is under indictment in 4 different cases, and that this is abuse of power. And now I happen to think he committed real crimes, or at least there's enough evidence to put him on trial. But for his supporters, this is an abuse of state power. And Trump is a very vengeful guy. So he's saying, well, you do this to me, I'm going to do this to you. But the kinds of people that he's talking about putting on trial include, well, actually now Robert Kagan for writing that article, but also that was not
good for a columnist anyway.
That was not Trump. That was one of his supporters, Senator Vance. But also Mark Milley, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who is America's senior military officer, and. I don't think it's an easy thing to destroy American democracy. As you say, there are so many checks and balances in the system. And I think even more than the legal and constitutional order, it's just that it's a big, complex, rich country. It's not Hungary, where there are 10 million people and there are not that many independent sources of power. There will be, the state governments of California. There's a lot of people who are not that easy to round up and intimidate, or the universities, et cetera, But I think he can do a lot of damage, and the trouble is that what he will do, well, there are various ideas floating around, which are all independently alarming. Certainly he'll put loyalists in charge of the Department of Justice, the Department of the CIA, and so on, and that will possibly give him certain powers. The other thing that people are talking about is that he talked about, during the Black Lives Matter movement, deploying the Insurrection Act, which would allow you to put American troops on the streets of America. And he was stopped by his own Attorney General, Barr, who was a very conservative guy, but who said, you can't do that. But if he had a complete loyalists in charge, well, would he try to do that? And then what would be the reaction to that? So I think just as likely as a sort of sudden collapse of democracy in the United States is real civil unrest and civil violence. And weirdly, the one thing that might save them in the short term but be a big problem in the long term is if Trump wins, I don't think he'll have trouble immediately. I think if he loses, he will immediately say, as he did last time, the election was rigged and try to bring people onto the streets. If he wins, he'll be inaugurated, and then we'll see what happens after that.
Yeah, and if he loses the second election, whether he would leave after that, that would be a bit...
Well, that's, but by, even he's mortal,
Yeah, then let's move to... to China and Russia also, which you discuss, of course, in the book. These were two systems that were heavily institutionalized as well under communist time.
Yeah.
Succession is the main problem a dictatorship has to solve, and both systems throughout history have found different ways of dealing with this to provide stability. So in Russia, it was kind of a collective entity that managed to replace leaders. This is gone with Putin. But as well in China, as you say, they had managed to have a limitation on power which worked for these two mandates, for these two mandates, which gave everyone a fair chance to be at the top or not to be purged or so on. But Xi Jinping has also destroyed that. So they are now, both systems now face collapse when they leave, or chaos, because there is no succession order into this. How could they, is this something worries you? How could they? Well, in the case of Putin, it's quite obvious, but maybe in the case of China, it was very surprising, and he has done this at a great cost, and imposing heavy purges, right, in order to change the system.
Well, I think that one of the characteristics that a lot of these leaders try and do is to change the constitution so they can stay on in power indefinitely. So that I think Putin for a while tried to actually obey the constitution, at least in theory, and in practice. He stepped down, if you remember, in 2008 because he wasn't allowed to have another term, and then they put Medvedev in, and then he came back, and that was a big moment when Putin comes back. And I remember being in Moscow at that time, and there were huge demonstrations in Moscow protesting against him coming back. Actually, that's another characteristic, is often these people are unpopular in their capital cities because it tends to be more educated, wealthier class of people. But anyway, so Putin, and then when I was again in Russia in 2019, he'd given himself another 2 terms, and people were beginning to worry, well, what happens when he steps down? The people around him because by then the system was so personalized that it wasn't just him, it was a whole group of people whose wealth, whose position in society was dependent on Putin now. So they wanted him to stay on. And then Xi Jinping, the same. He also changes the constitution to allow himself essentially to rule for life. And he creates a cult of personality by not only abolishing term limits, but by putting Xi Jinping thought into the Chinese constitution, which Mao was the last person who did that. And Erdogan in Turkey, same business. They changed the constitution, moved from a prime ministerial to a presidential system, give himself the ability to stay on. And it's not surprising that they should seek to do that. I mean, aside from pure ambition, because their whole political pitch is that I'm a savior, once you say that, then you say, well, really the country can't kind of do without me because, as one of Putin's supporters said, without Putin there'll be no Russia. And that is the central proposition of these leaders.
And do you fear that, for example, Xi Jinping, as it happened with Putin, at some point they would only have a way to legitimate their rule by entering into war, especially if economic results are not showing as it is the case? So is war the last escape of this personality, of these authoritarian leaders?
Well, that is a risk. I mean, so when I was finishing the book just as Putin invaded Ukraine, or the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and it made me think, maybe I've concentrated too much on what these leaders do internally, to get control of their countries, and not thought enough about what they do externally. But to the extent that they say that, one, I represent the nation, two, the nation is being humiliated and is under attack by external enemies, it's not totally surprising if they would then seek to demonstrate their strength overseas through war. And Putin is the most dramatic example, but actually Modi in India is an interesting example, so that India suffered for some time from terror attacks, which they said were sponsored by the Pakistanis. And there was a big one, I think in 2008, and the then Indian government did not respond. They didn't bomb India, didn't bomb Pakistan. But Modi broke that taboo in 2019 and bombed Pakistan just ahead of an election. And in his campaign, he said, and that was a risk he got away with, actually, but it's always a risk when one nuclear power bombs another one. But he said, if you're voting for me, you're voting to shoot India's enemies in the chest. There was a sort of, a rhetoric of violence, at least, around that. So I think that if your pitch is that I'm a strong leader who's going to save the nation, it's very hard for you to compromise with the external enemy.
And then moving to a character that you also portrayed here and who's today very relevant and has also some things in common with Modi, with this Netanyahu. But both changed or tried to change the character of a country which was essentially, not multinational in the case of Israel, but it was defined in terms that you could have identities. You could be an Arab Israeli, right?
Sure.
But both pushed the system, changed it in terms to an ethno-national. So what do you make of Netanyahu now that he has failed also to deliver not only democracy but also security, which was kind of the trade-off he was expecting to accomplish, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting the way in which India has changed its attitude to Israel, basically around this issue of ethno-nationalism. I mean, I remember being in Israel, in fact, the time I saw Netanyahu about a decade ago, and they weren't really, why should they be particularly attuned to Indian politics, but one of them said to me, it's a bit weird. There's this one party in India that seems to be much more pro-Israel than we're used to from India. And I said, well, there would be a reason for that. They're a party that is highly suspicious of Muslims and so on. But, I mean, I think that Netanyahu, in a way, is a classic strongman leader, or his pitch was that, the nation is under threat. I'm uniquely qualified. You've got to put more power in me. Get rid of it. And if you remember, in the 6 months up to the October the 7th attacks, Israel was in the middle of a huge domestic turbulence because he was trying to remove the court's abilities to declare things unconstitutional, and they were having massive demonstrations. And one of the other paradoxes about Netanyahu, I mean, he's fond of accusing foreign countries of anti-Semitism, but he was very close to Viktor Orban in Hungary, who I think ran actually an objectively anti-Semitic campaign against George Soros. Now, why was that? I think because they recognized something in each other. There was a sort of strongman pitch, kind of ethno-nationalism, suspicion of the European Union, illiberalism, and so on. But, you know, Netanyahu is also an interesting case because a lot of these strongman leaders that I write about are operating in democracies, not in autocracies, and they often then try to erode the democratic checks on them, and that was the fight that Israel was having. Orban has succeeded in doing that, I think, but then there's several who don't succeed, like Duterte loses an election or is unable to change the constitution to allow him to stay on. Bolsonaro lost in Brazil, and we've just seen in Poland the Peace Party, who I think if they had had another term in office, probably would have taken Poland fully down the road of Hungary. But yeah, the question is whether Netanyahu, I mean, coming back to Netanyahu, the question about him is, and I think one of the concerns about him is obviously his credibility as protector of the nation has been destroyed by October the 7th, but he remains in power because Israel is at war. And one of the concerns is that it may not be in his interest for the war to end, because when the war does end, there'll be an inquest in Israel about, well, why did this happen? And if you look at the opinion polls, he's very, very unpopular. Yeah. So he needs, again, state of emergency to say, you know, this is why I should stay in power.
Yeah. And then there is someone who's clearly not the not well-educated character, which is Boris Johnson, with a classic education. Yeah. Did Boris Johnson's education facilitated him to become a perfect demagogue?
Look, I mean,
because you could play. He can play so well with rhetoric and arguments and so on. So,
it was more. It wasn't really the education. It was he pitched himself in a very kind of British style with, he was, which appealed to the kind of sense of humour and so on. It's a kind of weird British thing, which I won't even attempt to explain. But I mean, I did hesitate about whether to include him in the book because, in some respects, he was a strong man and in others not. The reason I included him was that I think that, firstly, that the kind of liberal order in the West had two big blows in 2016, one of which was Trump's election, but the other of which was Brexit. And that the appeal that Johnson made was similar in some respects to the Trumpian appeal. It was anti-internationalist, anti-metropolitan, the country nationalistic. And that when Johnson begins to get into trouble, he then resorts to some of the Trumpist language. He starts talking about a deep state thwarting him, saying that, we need to start purging the civil service. I think one of the reasons that, whether it's down to his personality or the British electorate or the resilience of the system, but there was a sort of turning point in Britain, or a couple of them. First was when the Supreme Court ruled that he suspended Parliament to get Brexit through. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. Now, Donald Trump would have denounced the court and said, well, that's absurd, you can't do that. Johnson did accept the court ruling, which was important. But then the second thing is that eventually his party turned on him in a way that the Republican Party has not turned on Donald Trump. And so they got rid of him. But I'd like to believe that's because the British Conservatives have an innate sense of democracy. I think it's more that actually Johnson began to lose elections. There were 2 or 3 by-elections where he was losing very badly, and at that point the party said, actually, maybe time to go.
So then maybe one of the obvious questions is, in democracies, because in authoritarian regimes is different, how do you get rid of these guys?
Well, you've got a much better chance if you're still in a country with democratic institutions. So, I mean, it's an obvious answer, but the examples I gave, Duterte, Bolsonaro, they lose elections now, and they lose elections before they are able to do such damage to the institutions that the institutions survive. I mean, in Brazil, it was quite close. I mean, there were points where it looked like Bolsonaro might appeal to the army to come in. But actually the Brazilian army, a bit like the American army, was reluctant to get involved in politics. And that was important. And then, of course, because he particularly modeled himself on Trump, kind of engineered the January the 6th style event where the Brazilian Congress is stormed and so on. But it doesn't help him, and he's ushered out. So, yeah, if you're in a country where the democratic institutions are still standing, you've got a good chance. If you're in Russia or China, very, very difficult because, people say there's a lot of hope that, maybe the Russian people will rise up or whatever. But to give you another example from neighboring Belarus, where Lukashenko stole an election, something like a third of Belarusians came on the streets in an effort to overturn him. But a lot of people were shot in the streets, a lot of people were imprisoned, and that's kind of the model that Putin has been following. And I think that basically, if a strongman leader in an authoritarian country still has the army behind him and is willing to kill people in the streets, they will stay in power. One of the reasons, say, that Mubarak lost power in Egypt in 2011 was that he wasn't prepared to use to kill people in the streets. And then when Sisi overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood, well, they did actually. They killed something like 900 people in Cairo.
I think we have to bring this to a close. 5 minutes, so I have two last questions. One on a more positive, or maybe both I will try on a more positive note. You brought Merkel as a counter-example.
Yeah.
Yet Merkel was also very criticized for not taking decisions, for saying that the worst things she did was not to take courageous decisions, but the decisions she didn't take at some point. Was it? What do you make of Merkel as a leader with such a contradictory view?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I read it now, I probably would be a bit less charitable to Merkel. But I think nonetheless, she may have made policy mistakes. But there was no questioning her commitment to democracy and her willingness to leave power when she lost power. And in fact, she quite deliberately didn't adopt the kind of imperial trappings that a lot of these leaders have. I mean, I remember, just out of curiosity, going to look at her flat in Berlin, which was in a nice area, but it was a second-floor flat in a smart bit of Berlin, and the only way you could tell that somebody important was there was a police car outside. Right. So it was a very democratic form of living as well as acting. Now, of course, she wasn't head of state, so that helps. Macron, slightly differently, talks about being Jupiter, and he is the head of state, and he lives in the Elysee, etc. But I don't doubt that he'll leave power. So that's pretty fundamental, really.
And then your last chapter is about the battle of ideas.
Yeah.
To the extent to which some of these leaders, as you say, they have managed or they try to destroy the idea of democracy, even at the ballot box. We see that now the percentage of people who believe that elections are fair in democratic countries has shrunk.
Sure.
And
the number of people saying we need a strongman leader goes up.
Even among young people, right?
Yeah, particularly, actually.
So are we kind of... because counting votes used to be very easy, right? Mm-hmm. But now it's not about counting votes. It's counting people who think that the votes have been counted in a fair way. And it's, because of social media and all that, it's very easy to destroy faith of people in democracy and so on, right? Do you worry that in democracies also kind of the socialist space and the social media space, communication space is so damaged then it's very difficult to fight back against this kind of leaders or to make your arguments pro-democracy come across. You can be silenced, especially minorities and so on. Is that something which is fundamentally different now from what it was maybe when all this started or 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'd make 2 points, one about social media and one just about liberalism in general. I mean, I think that the sets of ideas that we've been calling democracy are liberal ideas. You know, they are about, as you said at the beginning, about institutions mattering more than people, about checks and balances, about the rule of law, and so on. And there have always been people who say that actually liberalism is just a disguise for the exercise of power by the privileged or by powerful groups in society, and don't believe liberalism, it's a lie. But those people were at the margins for the, you know, in the post sort of 80s era. But I now feel that that anti-liberal case is very strong both on the far right and the far left. And the centre's shrinking. The number of people who say, actually, you know, the system may be flawed, but it's better than the alternatives, and we need all this, and you can believe the elections, and there is such a thing as objective truth, and the media isn't, you know, always lying, etc., etc. Those people still exist, but they don't necessarily command the kind of political space in the way that they did in the kind of heyday of liberalism. And so liberalism is under attack from both right and left. And I don't think that it's a coincidence. I mean, a lot of things are going on, but one of them, I think, is that this rise of authoritarian populism is happening at the same time as the rise of social media. And it will take a lot of study by maybe both historians and political scientists to figure out why. But, you know, I would guess that one of the problems is that it's the collapse of an agreed sense of authority, you know, so that if people can't even agree on what the basic facts are, it's very hard to get them to then have a debate about what to do about those agreed facts, which is sort of what politics in a democratic society is. If everybody's living in their own social media bubble, where they get constantly fed stuff that's either very pro-Trump or very anti-Trump, the same in whatever country, then they begin to inhabit different realities. And if they inhabit different realities, it's very, very hard to have the kind of common ground that you need to make a democracy work.
Okay, so, you know, for democracies to stop living stupidly and dangerously, as you say, facts, and reasoned reasons, and debate, and journals like Política Exterior, and, you know, I think we have to thank all of you for the effort to putting this together, to you, Gideon, for coming to help us with the relaunch of this new season of Política Exterior, and of course, you know, to our dear friends José Arelza and Pedro Relentless Rodriguez out there. Hi, Pedro. Thanks to all of you for coming here. Thanks for contributing to making this journal so amazing for so long. And, you know, we hope to hear more from you and to update also that book as it comes. Fortunately, not with a second volume with new authoritarian leaders, but or maybe just to declare the end of authoritarian leaders. So.
I hope so.
Thank you so much to everyone.